Well, thank you so much. Ron, you did a great job of talking through that. It's been a delight to be on the team developing this. So in terms of the arts, humanities, and culture, I think perhaps the most compelling reason for why to have this included is our own experience. So how many of you would say that in your own lives, for your own flourishing, you turn to the arts and the humanities and culture to help you flourish? All right, I rest my case, but I've got 4 more minutes, so I'll say a few more other things along those lines. Obviously, the importance of history, philosophy, religion, for understanding what human flourishing is and how it has been cultivated in the past. And these domains are important for individuals, but they're also important for the flourishing of groups and of societies as well. So Ron mentioned the Latin for flourishing. When we think about culture and flourishing, culture comes from the Latin colere, meaning to cultivate. So when cultivation, say on a farm, is successful, the plants under cultivation flourish. So similarly, turning to the human world, when human culture is successful, humans flourish. There's actually an entire field now exploring this connection. The positive humanities are a new field of academic scholarship, scientific research, and creative practice concerned with the relationship between culture and human flourishing. This is the work that the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project I lead at the University of Pennsylvania has been spearheading. So I'll talk about a little bit academic scholarship, scientific research, and creative practice. So academic scholarship, in terms of some of the work that we've been doing, we have an Oxford University Press book series on the humanities and human flourishing. And we have currently published 7 edited volumes on what the arts and humanities disciplines can contribute to the conceptualization and cultivation of human flourishing. So asking historians, for example, what is the value of history for life? Their initial answer was, interesting question. Nobody's asked us that question before. But they had a good time then investigating how their own work connects with flourishing. And that's the point of this, I think, in part, is to help connect what is going on in these disciplines in academia now more toward flourishing, which has traditionally been a resource or an inspiration for these disciplines, but all too often gets lost in the academic world. In terms of scientific research, 2 years ago, we published the Oxford Handbook of the Positive Humanities to try to get a sense of a lot of the social science research that's been done in this domain. I'll just mention briefly 3 particular areas, and there's ongoing exciting work along these lines. So first of all, connecting culture with physical and mental health. Greater engagement with arts and the humanities has been associated with greater longevity and reductions in mortality risk, as well as lower risk of developing mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, and dementia. When we think about the connection between culture and social connection, for example, arts engagement has been associated with improving a sense of community and group coherence, creating new social connections, and a general sense of belonging. When we think about culture and spirituality, for example, meaning and purpose, research suggests that meaning in life can be cultivated through, for example, music listening, creative expression in music, viewing complex visual art, through theatrical improvisation of life stories, and through listening to Ron Ivy read poetry to us. Still working on the IRB for that, but the research for that. But and then, of course, religious traditions around the world often rely on art, music, sacred texts, and other similar forms for the cultivation of spirituality. Finally, in terms of creative practice, there is lots of work in museums and other organizations that is now beginning to explore the connection between culture and human flourishing. Some of this work has been done by my lab, which, as Ron mentioned, is a National Endowment for the Arts research lab. We are currently setting up a collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum of Art to be able to explore these connections more deeply. And again, as Ron mentioned, you will all have an opportunity to explore these connections more deeply today after the sessions are over, where we'll go to the Palazzo Taverna, where we're going to have dinner we'll go there. There's so much beautiful art there. And so what we'll do is we'll spend some time with slow looking, just as a way to kind of decompress, kind of think about other ways of knowing, and not so much thinking about it in terms of art history or the academic side of it, but just the pure aesthetic enjoyment and the connection and allowing us to process as individuals and together in that way.
Excellent. Thank you, James. And I know we'll come back to you here in a minute. But Tim, could you speak to your research cross-culturally and then also within the program on this question of religious contribution to flourishing and kind of why we added the capabilities, the spiritual capability, and added that as a component. And feel free to riff on anything else you'd like to speak about, because it's wide-ranging on this presentation in terms of your contribution.
Hear me? Yeah. Well, first of all, it's amazing. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you. My head is just bubbling with thoughts, partly from being here and the presentations this morning. So I'll try and put them in some kind of coherence, hopefully, given I'm a bit sleep deprived. Yeah, the importance of spirituality has, it's really been emphasized by Tyler Vanderweel, our director of the Human Flourishing Program. So, together we've been working on a framework, as shared by you, and then, related ideas around how to conceptualize existence. One kind of taxonomy we've come up with is we call it a WHO plus framework, because we try and think about different ontological dimensions of existence. And you don't want to multiply the categories kind of beyond necessity, but we drew initially on the WHO definition of health as a state of complete mental, social, and physical well-being, not just the absence of infirmity. So there's 3 dimensions right there: physical, mental, social. But then some people would say it doesn't account for all of existence. And in particular, we're missing out on the importance of a spiritual dimension. And you could make an argument that could be accounted for to an extent by the other 3 dimensions. But then many people like Tyler would argue that you can't do that without remainder, without kind of something crucial being missed. And obviously, I don't need to make the case here for the importance of a spiritual dimension. But, he would say a majority of the population worldwide endorse some kind of spirituality. So it's important to them. This afternoon, we'll talk about a lot of the scholarship being Western-centric, but getting outside that bubble. And that's one aspect of that. But I think also relevantly, even people who are ostensibly secular, I think have experiences and values that come close to definitions of the spiritual or the sacred. So Marty Seligman, who founded positive psychology, for example, talked about meaning as a sense of self-transcendence through serving something one feels is bigger than oneself, whether it's one's community or tradition and so on. And that obviously kind of comes close to, I think, some definitions of spirituality. So we're seeing as a kind of crucial aspect of existence that deserves attention and is important to people. And just while I'm here, kind of link it into the conversation we've been having and the topic here. With our work, I always try and frame it as provisional, work in progress, as partly get out work, in case I miss something, and I say, well, we're still working on it. So with this WHO plus framework, that's not exhaustive necessarily, and we've been trying to think about potential existence of other ontological dimensions. So one interesting one, James and I were talking about this yesterday, would be cultural, as in that's not reducible necessarily to the physical or mental or the social, but maybe it's a different dimensions. If you think about where do numbers and equations exist, or principles like democracy or archetypes, for example. So maybe that's another dimension. And then perhaps most relevantly here, the notion of the virtual. So we have a virtual existence that's separate, or it's not reducible to those other dimensions. And that's something worth thinking about. And then even more provocatively, this is where my mind has been spinning since this morning, especially after Michael and Janet made some remarks about love in relation to AIs. And when we think about virtual existence, that applies to us as human beings, but also what's this nature of this strange entity that's being created, existing in this virtual space? And how best to, how do we think about how to engage in it relationally? Because we try and draw on analogies like, is this comparable to, you mentioned the printing press, for example. But the one that came to mind to me, it's almost like we've given birth to this child that we know is going to turn up to be a, unparalleled genius, but also very powerful and strong. And how do we act in relation to this child? And the idea, I don't know if I'm being hopelessly naive, but treat it with love, because maybe I'm thinking about, my wife and I have a young daughter. Like, how do we want to treat her so that she'll hopefully grow up to love us, even though she becomes more powerful and more intelligent? Treating her with love, and maybe there's other analogies there. For example, I don't want to tell her what to think, but maybe how to think. And I can say there's different philosophical and religious traditions, and I can't tell her which to believe in or which to endorse, but at least if I can introduce her to these systems, then perhaps, as she grows up and becomes wiser than me, but she'll have that background. And then, anyway, that's the thought. I'm having a conversation, Julianne, about, what is this being and what's the nature of relationship with it? And I think that's something I'm just mulling over being here. Sorry, I'm probably rambling at this point, but I'll stop.
From this morning, in terms of how this plays out in terms of the human flourishing framework in the context of the conversation about AI. Well, I want to turn next to Elizabeth and get your perspective on how we navigated the question of the sacred and your thoughts about ends at the core of the framework, just from your background and expertise.
So part of the reason that we ended up with the symbol as opposed to a word is that we feel that a symbol invites us deeper into this sense of the sacred. Like Father Philip was saying this morning, one of the difference between us and machines is that we are capable of apprehending meaning. And there is something about symbols that brings us into these deeper levels of meaning. So I have a quote from St. Augustine about this that I think is really resonates with what we are saying. He says, truths which are presented to us in figures and symbols tend in some manner to nourish and arouse that flame of love by the impulse of which we are carried upward and inward towards rest. And of course, for Augustine, rest always means the fullness of relationship with God. They stir and enkindle love better than if they were set before us unadorned, without any symbolism of mystery. So by pointing us towards the symbol of the rose and tying it with this sense of the sacred, the transcendent, which a lot of the social science research and theology, my world, point us towards, we hope that this dialogue of human flourishing opens us up to look for different layers, different ideas. And I think we found the rose really just to sort of show how these layers and meanings unpack from symbols. Just a few reasons that the idea of the rose is very powerful in capturing this idea of the ends and the meaning of life. That a rose reminds us that there is a givenness to human nature. There's a givenness to the created world, that artifice, things that we make, artificial intelligence, can never capture. There's something beyond us. The rose reminds us of the reality in human life of both growth, flourishing, but also death, that there is an end. And then Ron had this on the slide. The rose reminds us of the reality of beauty, that art, that culture, that relationships can take us beyond ourselves, but at the bottom of the rose, there are always thorns. And so there can be a bitter, Father Michael was reminding us in the Catholic tradition earlier today, there's always hope, but there also is a bitterness. There's a sense that this world, that our lives aren't the way that we feel that they should be. And the project of human flourishing, particularly human flourishing in relationship to AI, which can promise us a utopia, needs to always be aware of both the beauty and the pain we all experience.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Lindsay, I know a big part of our conversation was about capabilities and how to think about that, whether to incorporate capacities or potential, or what can you give, based on your background and your expertise, why capabilities are so important to think about in the context of flourishing, and why we put that into the center of our framework.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Thanks very much again for inviting me here. Great to be back after our work last year. So I had two goals this morning. One was to come and meet everyone for these generative conversations, which is already achieved. Second one, as you know, I am hoping to see the turtles which I am, yeah. So just before, I was pleased but surprised to get this question because it's something I've thought about a lot, but it's not the typical type of question you get asked. One thing I'll say just to preface it, I'm in the Faculty of Education, so a lot of this work I see through the lens of education and pretty much put simply how much of this work and how much of that circle in the Human Flourishing Framework is teachable and learnable. You mentioned the word changeable, but fundamentally I look for curricula and what we can teach and learn in formal and informal settings. So all of my comments will kind of follow that lens. So firstly, when we're looking for candidates, I, like you, love words, and I take words really seriously. They have real effects in people's lives. So when we were looking for a candidate word, which embeds a set of concepts and practices, capacity was one of the words, and then capability was another option. But other words that might come up, candidates, competence, efficiency, power, readiness, skill, strength, talent, or ability. And all of these words come with baggage, and different disciplines and places will pick on different words. My original training was as a clinical psychologist, so ability and talent are words which are very familiar. In economics, they may mean something else. Like James, I like etymology of words. So if we go to the old French of capacity and capability, capacity is capacité, but really similar etymology to capability, late Latin capabilis. In both cases, we're really talking about the ability to contain or the ability to hold something. And that's really relevant. We're hearing a lot of terms like resilience. I can hold, I can have composure, I can hold it together, these sorts of terms. But one of the important things for me in terms of capability as opposed to capacity, we could have a bag of capacity. We could have a car that has a big engine, but if we don't have a car or we can't drive the car, capacity alone is not good enough. So we prefer the term capability for several reasons. It really comes in at a higher order. Really think of capability as a cluster of abilities, a cluster of skills. At sometimes we'll have a capacity to do things, other times not. But the capability also implied the agency component. You can have a skill to ride a bicycle, but if you don't have a bicycle, you're not capable, which is Amartya Sen, a very crude summary of Amartya Sen's work. So that was one of the reasons we preferred the term capability. And at the heart of it, and if we take Amartya Sen's work, the idea of agency, that is, if we've got these capabilities, there are things we can be and do, which is quite relevant to the conversation we were having before about AI. So looking through this, the Human Flourishing Framework, if you look at the diagram, you've got the capabilities. I implore you to think about how much of each of those capabilities are teachable and learnable. I don't say are they or are they not. I specifically said how much, which is really another version of the nature-nurture argument from a long time ago. We can develop skills in teachings and learnings in most of those areas. I would argue all of those capabilities on that page can be taught and learned to some degree. Even with physiology, for example, we've got capabilities of how we manage our own physiology in the short term and the long term. And we're continually hearing, at least in the Australian context, in terms of curriculum, why isn't that being taught in school? Why isn't that being taught in school? Often it is, but often it's not being taught in the way that is engaging students. One of the final comments I'll make is really capabilities are interesting in education. As I've said, people will think of them as how do we develop talent into abilities. a good example. And also from a social justice perspective, we've heard about Martha Nussbaum's work. In each of those cases, there appears to be debates about what's the curriculum. If we take a traditional school view, there's always debates about what should be in the curriculum. In economics, there is an economic policy, there's debates about what we should teach because it's going to drive the economy. And Martha Nussbaum's approach is really a list version, similar to this framework. There's a list of things we think are useful, a list of things which we think of as capabilities. And people will argue about what should be in, what shouldn't be in the same way eudaimonia, so the Aristotelian view of flourishing, people will argue about should we have is there only one way to achieve flourishing in terms of ethics, or is there a more liberal interpretation? Can we do it in different ways? But I would argue that in all cases, these are arguments about what's in the list, and you can see them through a teachable, learnable curriculum viewpoint. So to loop back, I think the reason capability is better is it comes in at a higher order, and it talks to us about how we use our talents to develop skills and abilities, and in all cases, interactions with our environment, or as we've heard today, relationality. So with that, capability implores us to think about how we're interacting with our environments. So I will leave it at there, and thank you for your promise of turtles.
Thinking about social connection and belonging, and within the framework, social connection shows up as part of individual good. It's an outcome that we experience. It's also a social capability, and it's also a context that we're in terms of facilitator. Can you just explain from your perspective in psychology and neuroscience and all the research you've done with Surgeon General, et cetera, why is social connectedness so central to flourishing?
Thanks. I want to just first start by expressing my incredible gratitude and humility to be here today. And I think, of course, it's no coincidence that we're trying to figure this out together, right? Not in isolation. And so social connection is so critical to flourishing. And as you were reading your poem, I was reminded of a quote by C.S. Lewis, and I tried to look it up. I don't have good signal here, so I'm going to do it from memory, so please forgive me if I get it a little bit wrong, but it's something to the effect of friendship, like philosophy, like art, has no survival value, but it brings value to survival. Interestingly, the scientific evidence shows that it does indeed have survival value. So it is both. And so I think that that is important because, of course, James already also talked about the importance of art. And so one of the things that we see across interdisciplinary evidence is that social connection is key to not only individual, but also community and population flourishing. That includes emotional and psychological well-being, health, safety, and prosperity. And we have very strong evidence of this. And in part, I think this is such a core element of human flourishing because humans are fundamentally social beings. If we think about across, first off, we see across social species that the social environment, both early and later in life, is one of the strongest predictors of both morbidity and mortality. And of course, humans are one of the most vulnerable species at birth. And throughout human history, we have needed others to survive. I mean, just all you have to think about is a human infant, if left alone, would literally die. But throughout our course of life, we have needed to rely on others. And because it's such a critical element of survival, our brains and our bodies function most optimally when we are social. And so if we think about even just from a standpoint of um, uh, both the threats that if we are alone, we have to be more vigilant to threats in our environment. We have to meet the challenges of everyday life on our own. And so when we are alone, it causes us to need to be. It's more effortful. It's far more vulnerable. And so when we function most optimally socially, what happens is that there's also dysregulation when we are not social. And this shows up in our biology and can influence and put us at risk for um, mental health, cognitive health, and physical health kinds of outcomes. And we see common and have robust evidence of some of the biological mechanisms that demonstrate this. We also have very robust evidence from hundreds of studies, millions of participants, and has been shown repeatedly over and over, including multiple meta-analyses that show that this is directly linked to mortality and an independent predictor of mortality. So just for instance, in my own research, we showed that that lacking connection, so isolation, loneliness, that loneliness carries a risk for earlier death by 26%, isolation by 29%, living alone by 32%. But I think the optimistic thing to take away from that is we found that being socially connected was associated with a 50% increased odds of survival, and was significantly far more so than these indicators of lacking connection. And so there's a powerful protective effects of being socially connected. But of course, this goes beyond just health. As I mentioned, it also influences individual flourishing from performance-based decision-making, education, and economics. But importantly, and this is where I think is really important, Ron, when you talked about it's not just about the individual good, it's about the common good. And we see that socially connected communities are far more benefit as well and can flourish as a result. This includes that when communities are more connected, they are healthier. We see this in evidence in terms of all sorts of different kinds of outcomes, including spread of disease. Communities are safer. There's less crime, less violence. We also see this in terms of resilience. And we see that communities that are more connected are better prepared for and recover more quickly, even from natural disasters. And that physical proximity of having close others and being able to come together in times of crises can help not only the individual, but the communities thrive. And so when you mentioned that relationality is fundamental to flourishing, I smiled because I could see this theme across all of these elements and how critically important that is. And I see it as a critical issue as we think about what is the future of human connection as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Julianne. And last but not least, Dennis, would you share a bit about the importance of values and why values are central? I know you've done a lot of research on moral values and its relationship to economics and this new economic paradigm. Can you share about that?
Sure, it's wonderful to be here and talk about values. There's a lot to be said about values in the sacred sphere, in the physiological one. But what I'd like to concentrate on is the role of values in enabling us to join forces to meet common challenges. Most of the challenges that we face in life are common challenges. And most of the achievements that we've made in life are achievements that we've achieved in common with other people. And we have the ability to draw on a wide variety of value systems. There is the deontological value system, is the virtue ethics, is utilitarianism. And these different value systems often conflict with one another. And even within these systems, there are conflicts, which people who have faith, people who have purpose, are able to resolve. And I believe that the simplest way of understanding that resolution is that when we seek to draw on that constellation of values that enables us to join forces with other people in order to address the challenges that we face, then we have drawn on the appropriate values. So if one seeks to understand in what sense can values be objectively appropriate, that is a functional sense in which they can be. So let's be specific. Climate change, biodiversity loss are global problems. And therefore, they can only be addressed at the global level. And this means that when we address these problems, we need to draw on values that connect us in our common humanity. All of us being in the image of God is one way of connecting us beyond the bounds of any particular religion or culture or nation. When we have the problem of water shortage, that is a regional problem, and that requires that we need to connect regionally. And then there's a multitude of problems that are national problems, and nation states have drawn on values that connect us at that level, and so on to the regional, local, family level. And one thing that we should keep in mind in addressing these problems is the principle of subsidiarity, that addressing problems at the lowest level that is appropriate for those problems is something that will promote our sense of agency, and it's also something that will enhance our sense of solidarity at the level at which it's likely to be most effective. And therefore, understanding values in terms or as instruments that will connect us as human beings to address our challenges, I think is a fruitful way of looking at things, even though I do not in the slightest wish to devalue the concept of values. That they are intrinsically important is something that it is absolutely vital that we believe in order to be motivated by these values. And human beings have this extraordinary capacity to connect at many different levels. We can connect on the family level, we can connect on the national level, regional level. We can connect across regions to religions and so on. We are very flexible in our affiliations. And what we often forget is that we do not often make adequate use of this flexibility. Because with globalization, commercialization, financialization, our problems have become much larger in scale and also wider in scope. And AI, the new technologies, should take note. They should enable us to use our flexibilities in order to meet these big challenges that we face. And values are the drivers, the motivators, the engine that will get us there, provided that they are connected with institutional mechanisms that avoid free riding. There are large individual differences. There will always be people who do decide not to share our values or to ignore them, and they must be brought in line. So encouraging cooperation at the appropriate level, at the appropriate scale, and the appropriate scope, and suppressing destructive competition through institutional mechanisms are the means whereby we can surmount the big challenges that we face.
Excellent. Thank you, Dennis. I mean, the idea of values transcends, goes from the individual all the way out to the common good. And that's been a big part of our reflections. And I know we'll talk more about that this afternoon, especially when we get into business and economics. Do we have a few more minutes for a couple questions? Are we okay? We're at time, but we'll come back to this conversation. Please feel free to engage with each other on these questions at lunch. We'll come back and we'll get into some of the questions around cross-cultural engagement and local participation and business and economics. Any logistical direction, Matthew, in terms of our next steps?
Can I actually kick it to Giuseppe? Can they go down now or? Okay, and will you lead the way, my friend? Okay, follow Giuseppe. Oh,
A parish announcement. Tomorrow morning, our parish is nearby, St. Peter's Basilica. I think you saw it on your walk in. So we have the great grace of this opportunity for a Mass. I warn you, it's a bit early. The Mass will start at 7:15 a.m. It's not an obligatory activity, but all are welcome. On a practical level, I ask that any priest who would like to concelebrate with me go to the sacristy. You can go to the sacristy through the side entrance that we all came into today, or you can just go into the normal basilica and walk to the sacristy. If you have any questions about that, ask me or the guards. You're welcome to come to the sacristy and vest with me. I'll enter the basilica at about 7 a.m. to go to the sacristy and get ready for the Mass. For those who would like to participate, I ask you just go into the basilica, the normal security check. There is a white tent now, a white tent known as the Pilgrim Way. And it's meant to facilitate those who are going into the basilica for activities like this, for Mass or prayer, to get through the security line, kind of skip the line. So if you see a line in the square as very intimidating, go to the white tent, and you just tell the guard, I'm here to pray, I'm here to go to Mass, and you should have a bit of an easier, more direct access into the basilica. And then you can go toward the main altar. Usually it would be easy to identify by the glorious Bernini Baldacchino, which right now is actually completely covered in renovation. So it's not as glorious and splendid as usual, but it's still big. So go toward that main altar, and I will come out of the sacristy and bring you down the stairs into the crypt area. So you can follow me down to the crypt. I can also, make sure this message gets to you in writing in case you forget anything. But if you're just inside about 7:15 inside the basilica, we'll go down together in the crypt area. It's a beautiful chapel, a little on the small side, so I apologize in advance if there's not a seat for everyone, but everyone is most welcome, but I will not be personally offended if you decide to sleep instead. After the Mass, I'll take a few moments to point out some highlights of the Basilica, and then make sure that everyone has time to grab a coffee and be ready for the start of our activities tomorrow. Thank you.